All right, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining today's national meeting session on digital evidence management. What do we do with all of the footage? My name is Carrie Shelton. I'm the CNA Deputy Project Manager with BJ's Body-Worn Camera Training and Technical Assistance Program. I apologize for those of you that have heard this before, but I'm going to go over a few helpful tips as we begin today's session. As a reminder, please keep your phones or computer audio on mute to avoid background noise. We are recording this session so others can view it later on our website. If you'd like to ask questions, please go ahead and use the chat function to do so. You can send a question at any time throughout the session, and you can access it on your computer at the bottom center of your screen. If you're using a mobile device, the chat function is in the top right corner of your screen. As a reminder, points of view or opinions expressed herein do not necessarily represent the official position or policies of the U.S. Department of Justice. And now I'll pass this over to our presenters. I'm going to give it to Dr. Craig Uchida, who is one of our leads for the Body-Worn Camera Program, a senior advisor. Dr.
Great,
Uchida?
thank you. Thanks, Carrie. Good morning and good afternoon to everyone. And I'm Craig Uchida. I'm the president of Justice and Security Strategies. I'm also a researcher. I would like to introduce Dr. Shelley Solomon. She's the CEO of Justice and Security Strategies. I might also add that she is the executive project director for the Small Rural and Tribal Body-Worn Camera Program that John Markovic mentioned yesterday. So we also provide funding for small rural and tribal agencies across the country. Next is Dr. Chuck Katz. You just heard from Dr. Katz and in the previous panel, which, by the way, Chuck, that was great. I love that panel. Good interaction with everybody, and I hope we can do the same here as well. We're going to talk about body-worn camera footage and what goes on with all of that footage. And the idea here is this broader category of digital evidence management, which we'll touch on. We'll present some of the findings from our studies that we did across 7 jurisdictions. I want to explain our flow chart of body-worn camera footage. And then we're going to discuss 4 topical areas that I hope you can chime in on, the audience that is, with questions and issues that you may have as well. So please use the chat. Please do so at any time during our discussion. And even while I do this presentation overview, we'd like to hear from you so that we can clarify issues and provide some answers, I hope. So just overall, digital evidence management is simply everything that you've digitized. It's information, it's data, it's anything, frankly, that you've received on your phones, on your computers, whatever. And as it relates to law enforcement, it's now burgeoned to include a lot of information. Departments now are using platforms for their case management systems and integrating their footage, their photos, all kinds of evidence. And I think you'll hear more about this type of integration in another panel that specifically looks at this in more detail. Some of the examples we have are obviously cell phone data, not only your body-worn camera footage, CCTV footage, in-car video, things of that nature are incorporated within this whole realm of DEM. Next slide. So part of what we did almost 3 years ago now, we started to look at this whole influx of data. And I referred to data as body-worn camera footage. John Markovic a few years ago posed this question to us about, what's going on with all the footage? What are we doing? And what should agencies be prepared for with this influx of information. At the time, we started this 7 years ago in 2015, and we didn't realize at that time how much footage was actually going to come through and how much footage you would actually have. And it's pretty daunting, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. So what we started to do was look at 7 jurisdictions across the country. We wanted to track the numbers of videos at each stage of different processes, and I'll show you that in a minute. We wanted also to determine the issues and challenges faced by agencies that were and are and will be dealing with all of this evidence and all of this footage. So we're going to talk about 3 sites today. Most of the work I did was in LA with the LAPD. LAPD currently has about 9,300 sworn, 2,500 civilians, almost 4 million in population. And they adopted their cameras in 2015. We did evaluations of their products and of what they did with them, and we can share that later if you'd like. Chuck, do you want to talk a little bit about Phoenix?
Phoenix was one of the early adopters of body-worn cameras. Back in about 2013, they received one of the first federal grants to really implement and test body-worn cameras. They're a large agency, around 3,000 sworn, about 1,000 civilians. And the body-worn cameras that have been deployed in Phoenix it's really been a slow but a deliberately paced implementation of body-worn cameras. Started off with 1 precinct where it was tested about half the precinct, and since then it's slowly and incrementally increased throughout patrol, and then finally into investigations as well as specialized units.
Okay, good. Dr. Solomon, why don't you tell us about South Florida?
Well, South Florida, we looked at Fort Lauderdale, which is the smaller of the agencies we're talking about. They have about 535 sworn. They get about 200,000 calls for service each year, a population of about 180,000. And they were hesitant initially to adopt body-worn cameras back in 2016, but in 2018, they did decide that it was within their, and when I say they, the city government overall, they were worried about privacy concerns, but they did adopt them in 2018 and provided each officer with about 2 body-worn cameras per officer. We also, because of the way they're structured and they work very closely with the Broward County State Attorney's Office, we looked at how they're managing body-worn cameras. The state attorney is responsible for working with the Broward Sheriff's Office and about 20 to 30 jurisdictions in Broward County. They have about 213 attorneys. Their population is about 2 million. And within their jurisdictions, they're working with, a sheriff's office, obviously Fort Lauderdale, but also they have a tribal agency that they work with as well as the suburbs. So they're a very diverse prosecution office.
So part of what we were trying to do here was standardize the way in which we could count things, right? We wanted to see how much video was being accumulated in each of these departments, the proportion to their number of officers, and the storage that was used. And so, Dr. Solomon, you want to talk a little bit about what they're doing in Broward and Fort Lauderdale, numbers wise?
Well, in Fort Lauderdale, as noted earlier, they have about 535 officers. Each one has about two cameras, each officer, and they're recording about 270 kilobytes of video of 270,000 videos each year. They did in 2019. When we looked at 1 month of data, they were uploading about 21,000 videos per month. So this was averaging about 693 videos a day. They represent about a third of the videos that are going into the Broward State Attorney's Office that they're getting from all the jurisdictions. The Broward State Attorney's Office is when we looked at it, they had about 1.4 million videos associated with 111,000 cases. So, they did note that in some cases there were, 700 or 800 video files or different types of digital evidence that were associated with just one case. So there's a lot of digital evidence that's coming in per case. So.
And Chuck, you want to talk about Phoenix a little bit here too?
Yeah, so this was at a point in 2019 prior to full implementation. It was getting close to most of the patrol officers having body-worn cameras, but not quite. There were about 800,000 videos in 2019 at about 300 terabytes of data. And it was just getting to the point where Phoenix was starting to recognize the size and magnitude of what things were going to start to look like. And they were starting to develop better estimates of what things would look like in the future and how they were going to have to deal with the sheer amount of storage that was going to be required.
And in Los Angeles, with 7,000 officers who have cameras, and these figures are from 2019, they had 4 million videos that year, and that number continues to persist. So in 2021, they also had 4 million videos, and it amounted to about 800,000 hours of video recordings as well. So there's a huge amount and huge number of footage that they have, and this is the flow chart that we put together. And each of the sites that we worked with, we asked about these different stages in the process. And so a lot of what, and this one's fairly detailed just because it's LAPD and because they have a lot of different steps in their process. But I think the flow chart itself is important for a couple of reasons. One, it shows the beginning with patrol officers and what they're uploading and what they're doing. But it also shows how the rest of the agency is involved with the footage, both in terms of compliance checks and audits and things of that nature, but also in terms of arrests. The arrests need to indicate that they have a body-worn camera video, and when that arrest does get filed, then the DA's office knows that there is video attached to that, and so it will flow through the criminal justice process in this way. The other things that are done with the footage are with respect to uses of force, officer-involved shootings, citizen complaints, other types of things that are necessary for the department to follow. So I see a question here about data retention. Did agencies have policies in place to remove general non-event data, or were they required to keep everything? In Los Angeles, they have infinite storage, and so for the most part, they have kept everything. In the other agencies, however, like in Fort Lauderdale, you want to speak to that a little bit, Shelley?
Sure, I can. And in Fort Lauderdale, they have their retention rates range from 90 days to what they refer to as until manually deleted. So it depends on the type of incident. So if, for example, traffic, they keep for 90 days and then they delete. But this requires the officers to do the tagging of the videos in order for this to work appropriately. So what they found when they looked at the tagging was that they had around a 65% compliance rate. So that was affecting that, but they do remove their videos, but they have 100 different categories of tags that they can use. So it gets kind of complicated, and that's how they decide what gets retained and what gets deleted. So the tagging becomes very, very important, and compliance with that tagging becomes very, very important. So,
yeah. One of the things I was going to bring up is, and I know these flowcharts were your original idea, and that you're sometimes a little bashful about it, but I really think they're important in several different ways for the agencies. And I know you're modest about this, but I really think it's important that agencies understand what the data flow look like in terms of their digital evidence. One of the things through this project that you ran, Craig, was that when we implemented the flow charts, it really was similar to, if you recall, Goldstein's work back in the 50s with the ABA when they charted the criminal justice system and how many crimes occurred, how many arrests there were. And, you know, these prosecutors were saying, wait, there were 100 arrests. Why aren't there 100 people in prison or jail? Well, that's because they go through the system and people are dropped out. But, you know, when we're talking 90 years ago, people didn't have a full appreciation of how people moved through the system. And I think that what this project did for the agencies that were involved in it was give them a broader understanding of how much data they're supposed to be collecting in an ideal world, how much they're actually collecting in terms of digital evidence, and then all the different hands that touch the digital evidence or are supposed to. And one of the things that we started to recognize was that different parts of whether it was within the police agency or within different agencies themselves, people weren't recognizing perhaps that information was available to them. They weren't aware that perhaps they needed policies for how to deal with some of that information, and really what the data flow is going to look like and the magnitude of it and how much they might expect, because some of them simply weren't prepared to review what they later recognized that they would have to. And I think that's one of the reasons why we're starting to see more body-worn camera units, is because there needs to be a coordination of just this massive amount of information and how we need to be directing it and dealing with some of these issues. And I do think that this exercise is really useful for agencies that are implementing body-worn cameras to make sure that everybody's on the same page.
Yeah, and it doesn't have to be this detailed, frankly. I mean, for smaller agencies, it's clearly not going to be, but you are going to see that there are linkages to arrests and the checks that you make on footage and things of that nature. And if you do have a critical incident, there is going to be a review of that of the footage for that incident in particular. And you want to know that, okay, here's how this is all working. Let's go to the next slide.
Well, I just wanted to add one
Go
more
ahead.
thing, that with respect to it, tagging stuff, this came out too, where in terms of like, what do they eliminate and what do they keep? You know, they recognized if there'd been a public records request, they need to keep it. So now they have a process to keep up with those types of requests. So it changes as the use of the video changes as it moves through this flow process as well.
So what we're going to try to do here is talk about four issues, and this is where, you know, if you do have questions, please put them in the chat and ask us, and I'm sure we're going to try to answer them as best to our ability. But these four: activation, deactivation, and compliance, critical incidents, public release. And importantly too is the transfer of footage to prosecutors and to the courts and to public defenders. So let's go to the next slide. So part of what we want to address are issues about policies, what perhaps the research does suggest about activation, and what kind of recommendations there are for policy, particularly with respect to activating and deactivating. So Chuck, you want to talk about the research and work that you did in Phoenix? And I love this stuff. This is really nerdy, but really interesting, and I think helpful, frankly, too, to departments to understand what you've done. So go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, thank you. So we've been working with Phoenix Police Department since around 2012 on issues around body-worn cameras. And over that time, we've really seen the evolution of policy changes, not just in Phoenix, but nationwide. Mike White does a nice job every year pulling together sort of a policy brief in terms of what all the different policies are across the nation in terms of body-worn cameras within agencies. What we wanted to do was look a little bit about what activation looked like, right? We can put a body-worn camera on everybody, but maybe not everybody's going to turn it on, and maybe they're not going to turn it on in every incident. And we wanted to understand why that is and what are some of the factors that are related to it. What we found was that policy matters, and that shouldn't surprise many of the police leaders on this call. But if you take a look at the far left of the slide, what you'll see is that first line shows when a policy was just starting to be announced, and prior to this revised policy, Phoenix PD had a policy in which officers were required to turn on their camera when either they arrived at the scene or they were going to have a law enforcement contact. There was quite a bit of discretion there, particularly around service and order maintenance activities. And you can see that we had activation rates hovering at around 40 to 50%. Once a new policy was announced, we really started to see activation jump. Phoenix PD changed from a policy that allowed for a bit more discretion to one that really confined discretion and stated that when an officer receives a call for service, the minute that they decide to take that call, they have to turn on their body-worn camera. In other words, it's going to be on from the time that they get the call and the drive to the incident itself. So it's going to be on regardless of any special event or incident that might be taking place that might distract the officer when they arrive. And you can see that activation rates popped up to a little bit above 80% and then started to hover down. Since then, we've seen rates actually increase a bit since then with some further work that we're doing. It's hovered between 80 and 90%, depending upon what's going on. But we did found that there was substantial differences in terms of when body-worn camera was activated. The first and foremost, obviously, that had the largest impact was policy. But we also found that some individual level factors mattered as well. Interestingly, females were significantly less likely to activate their body-worn cameras than others. And if people are interested, I'm more than glad to talk to you about that. But there's some real differences between males and females activating their body-worn cameras. Two is we found that incidents involving officer-initiated activity were significantly less likely to be activated, such as a suspect or vehicle stop that's initiated by the officer. Third, we found that leadership matters. Depending upon who the commander was, we had different activation rates. We believe that different commanders had different approaches to communicating with their officers about their expectations, and that these expectations by leadership within precincts had a substantial impact on whether or not the officers activated their cameras. And then we did see some elements of neighborhood mattering. We found that officers who worked and the incident was in a neighborhood that had a greater proportion of Hispanic residents, officers were less likely to activate their body-worn camera. And what these data helped us do is think through issues of where we can start to tweak and improve our activation rates. With 80% activation rates, I would consider that solid. I would consider that fairly good. But how do we get from that 80% or 90% up to closer to 99%? I don't know if we can ever hit perfection, but we would like to get there as close as we can. And what we need to do is start to look at really those areas where we have some issues. Not necessarily, I mean, it's nice to do it on the officer level, and we want to do that, but we also want to know that what are these broader categories that we need to be focusing on, right? So if it's officer initiated activity, we need to be reminding officers, engaging them in training that when you're involved in a suspect stop, vehicle stop, even though you might be thinking it's a friendly stop, even though you might be thinking that it's something that might be fairly benevolent, not as important as perhaps others, it can go sideways. There can be issues in which that video is important and might be used in a variety of different matters.
So we got a question here too, Chuck, about I think it links back to the retention issues too. That when you require activation on call, it could impact or greatly impact the amount of data that's captured, right? And was this the assumption that their leadership also understood the financial impact of the policy change? So,
No, that's a great question. They did take that into consideration. Right now, Phoenix is going through a number of changes in terms of policies and administrative related matters. And what they're looking at right now is what do we have to do to accomplish and really get the job done right. And they're thinking about and dealing with, they're in communication with Amazon. They're looking at others about how they're going to store this, what the costs are going to be, and the costs are not minor.
yeah.
And you're correct. It's, you're talking about a response of it's an additional, 5 minutes per video, right? And that's a lot. When you add it up across an entire year, across a lot of officers, but they did have a number of incidents. When I say a number of incidents, there were a number of substantial incidents where an officer did not have time to turn on their body-worn camera because an emergency was occurring. For a variety of reasons, it wasn't activated. There was active scene taking place when an officer arrived, and they felt that it was best that it be turned on. The other one was that it was best when you're not thinking about some other issues, that your mind is going to be more in a place where you can activate that camera rather than waiting until you get there when things may be a little bit different than you had thought.
A couple other questions just popped up. So is there, let's see, you mentioned that in the policy matters. And do you know whether the department rigorously audited compliance on the original policy? So the one that they started off with, do you have a sense of, was that rigorously done and then they shifted, or how did they decide to change, I guess, the policy?
Boy, we have a research, we have a methodologist at hand. I agree with you. There were a lot of changes going on there, and the auditing process it increased slowly but surely. They started to put more pressure on the sergeants to be reviewing this information. Sergeants became more aware of it. They also would establish a body-worn camera unit, and while their job wasn't to audit these types of issues, it did start this cultural sort of phenomenon where there was more attention on those issues of activation. I think you're absolutely right, and I think your point is an important one to keep in mind.
I know in Fort Lauderdale, they did the body worn camera because their deletion was associated with the tagging and with the turning on of the cameras and everything. Their body worn camera administrator did start that auditing process on a pretty rigorous basis and started raising it with the sergeants and really watching that a lot more closely. And that's when they started to see their compliance rates go up.
There are a couple of other comments here too. John Markovic is saying too that like Shelley mentioned that Fort Lauderdale has 100 categories and of tagging, and that's a high number. I think we've found also that in LA and elsewhere there's maybe 25 or 30. But part of what one of the issues for that is, how specific, how general do you get with tagging these categories? And to me, it's a matter of how helpful is it to tag, to give a specific or general category. What's the outcome of how you're going to use those categories? And if it is to purge, then or retain or whatever, I think you need to be able to indicate how those categories will help you do those things and make them understandable as well. I think the other thing we're looking at are the metadata, which are the data within the platforms that you have for your body-worn cameras. Not everyone's aware of that metadata, but it's helpful to look at and to recognize that this is another way you can start to analyze data. So let's move on. I'm sorry. Let's talk about other issues here. I know we've got about 20 minutes left, which is fine. The other another aspect of your footage is critical incidents, and We know that these incidents, in fact, are probably the ones that have spurred the introduction of and use of and wanting more of with respect to the body-worn camera footage. And so, the questions here are, how is the footage used after a critical incident? What is the process? Did this have any impact on the community? And I just want to speak briefly to how the LAPD uses footage with their critical incident. And I think it's important to know that in LA, they have a very complex, I will say, accountability process when it comes to uses of force, critical incidents, and other events that are problematic to the department. So the body-worn camera footage is one aspect of their accountability process, and they have an entire division called the Force Investigations Division that looks at uses of force, especially officer-involved shootings, hits, and other types of incidents. That Force Investigations Division looks at every body-worn camera video that emanates from a critical incident. So it could be 2 officers having cameras, or it could be 20. Depends on the incident. Depends on how many people are involved and what they saw. I think the other important part of this too is that LAPD does not allow officers to review their footage before giving a statement to the investigators about the incident. That they can't, in other situations where they're making an arrest or writing a report, they can review that footage. But in this case, they have a special part of their policy that's very direct about not viewing it. The cameras themselves are taken by the supervisor when that supervisor arrives on scene, and they turn it over to the Force Investigations Division. So that division will look at, like I say, every piece of footage from every officer. But the other part I want to mention here too is that the context for all of this is not just that camera. It's also other video. It's CCTV. It's the in-car video. It's as much information that they can get from the public as well. So if there are iPhone cameras, etc., that becomes part of what they do. So in total, they're using this footage for their reporting, for their decision making, etc. That footage is also passed on to the LA County District Attorney's Office, that will also view the footage. So, and they're looking at it for criminal activity to determine whether charges should be brought against the officers. So that footage is transferred to the DA's office in that kind of way. So you have fairly extensive use of this footage in particular that I think is important to know. And I'll talk a little bit later about the public release. Chuck, you have anything about Phoenix, or Shelley, do you have anything with the South Florida that you want to raise?
Well, I would just say, for the critical incidents, the other thing that happens in Fort Lauderdale, besides the internal investigation, is they have a citizens review board. And so, they, in the period that we were looking at, they had referred about 8 of these cases to the citizen review board, and the camera footage for that citizen review board to look at. And I think when you think about the relationship with the community, that I think was helpful for them to have that process in place for the critical incidents. So.
The only thing I would add is with Phoenix PD, they adopted a model a lot like LA. And if you remember the early days when you were working with LA and some of the ideas about bringing the community in ahead of time, showing them what what had taken place, starting to communicate with some of the key stakeholders fairly early through the use of some of the body-worn camera video, and then creating a for lack of a better word, a presentation that incorporates the major talking points that PPD wants to communicate about the critical incident, and sharing those points. And they're all online through the police department. And that's been found to be very helpful in terms of getting some messaging out in terms of what took place in critical incidents.
Let's talk a bit about public release. There are a number of areas here with public release that I think are really important. And Shelley, do you want to talk about what goes on with public release in Fort Lauderdale and Broward?
Well, this has been one of the big issues for them, and a sticking point, I guess, across the way, with the policy that goes with public release, but also with respect to how other state policies and state laws that have been passed. For example, there's a Florida law, the Marsy's law, that deals with privacy, particularly in domestic violence cases for the victim. And so there's a lot of work that's being done to balance out what's being requested and the